Okay. Hi, everybody. We
Hello.
are just wait for a couple of minutes. There are some participants joining, so it'll take a couple of minutes for them to get added. Also, FYI, we are also streaming live on YouTube. Yeah, so it's quite broadcasted. Okay, great. We have some people here. All right, great. So, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today on a Friday evening. I know that this is supposed to be like kind of a switching off day towards the weekend. Just to quickly introduce myself, I'm Lavanya Behel. I'm the co-founder of Lawwiser. And a very warm welcome to you, as I said, to our webinar today, which is on the very, very relevant subject of ESG. As you all know, the theme today is titled Beyond the Checklist, From ESG Compliance to Sustainable Leadership. I'm sure that we're going to have a very interesting discussion today because we have a great set of speakers. It gives me great pleasure, firstly, to welcome our moderator for today's discussion, Vidhi Tukral. She is the Chief Manager for ESG at Max Life Insurance. And has a very interesting work profile because she has worked at the intersection of environmental law and policy for over a decade now. Apart from being a lawyer, she is also a CS by profession. And prior to her current role, she has worked with many organizations like Aviva, like WWF, and I think one or two, which I can't remember right now. Sorry. So anyway, over to you, Vidhi. Thank you so much for agreeing to moderate this panel. And yes, I leave it now to you to introduce the panelists. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lavanya, for setting up the context for today's webinar. And thank you to Lawwiser for holding this webinar on a crucial topic like ESG. Today, we will explore the latest trends and best practices in ESG. We will discuss the regulatory landscape of ESG, effective stakeholder management, circular economy with focus on extended producer responsibility, and the role of general counsel in integrating ESG considerations. As Lavanya mentioned, we have fantastic lineup of speakers who will share their experience on ESG today with us. Now, I will start to introduce our first panelist, Ms. Sanjeet Kaur Batra. She is a Group Vice President Legal and Legal Head for Cummins India. She has extensive experience in leading legal, secretarial, and compliance functions. Also, her policy advocacy efforts make her a powerhouse of expertise and insight for today's discussion. Thank you, Sanjeet, for joining us today. Next, we have Zameen Athani, Group General Counsel at Car Dekho. He has more than 2 decades of senior executive experience. He's known for his forward-thinking leadership, drives long-term growth, and believes in building purpose-driven culture. Thank you, Zameen, for joining us today. Next, we have Amit with us, who is the Director and Co-Lead of Strategy, Transformation and Reporting, KPMG. He has been working in space of sustainability advisory for more than 14 years and has experience in environment and climate change. We also have Rajiv with us, who has more than 2 decades of experience in legal, secretarial, and compliance functions. He joins from Vedanta, India. So thank you, Rajiv, for being with us today. And thank you to all the panelists for joining us for today's webinar. We will open this webinar with questions for each of the panelists. And towards the end, we will have a Q&A question for everyone, for the audience. So please put in your questions in the chat box and write to us, and we'll have the panelists pick up the questions and answer your queries. So as the context is laid down and we know the objective of this webinar and we know what is going to be covered, I will now turn our gaze at the first question, which will be for Ms. Sanjeet. My first question to you, Ms. Sanjeet, is how has SEBI's ESG disclosure framework impacted Indian companies? What are your views on this?
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Vidhi and Lawvisor, for inviting me for this very interesting discussion. And ESG, of course, is the buzzword and has significantly changed the landscape of the regulatory environment across the world. And in India, of course, we are no different. So while we've had multiple laws, that have been focusing on corruption, anti-bribery, money laundering, employment-related issues, health and safety, etc. But for the past few years, we now, of course, have a reporting mechanism, the ESG reporting mechanism, which has created a lot of emphasis on the various ESG metrics of environment, social, and governance, and have also led to bringing in a lot of transparency in the corporate world about how the organizations are moving ahead with their sustainability and the other ESG related targets. So as we are all aware, we've had this formal BRSR reporting for the past couple of years, and it's just going to expand the scope, making it mandatory for the top 1,000 listed entities by market capitalization to be disclosing and filing the BRSR report over the next few years. And what we are seeing in the real world, as a part of the organizations that we are working with, is that it has led to a lot of rethinking. A lot of organizations have been doing work in the ESG space. Many of us have our sustainability targets anyway, but because of the ESG reporting that has been brought into the SEBI regulations, etc., there's a new emphasis in understanding, for example, what are the supply chain and the value chains that we are working with. Understand the whole concept of ESG rating and how investors are slowly viewing investing in various organizations. There's also a renewed focus on the claims that any organization is making, because there are more and more we are seeing whether it is the consumer lobby or the community lobby, there's so much focus on making sure that greenwashing and social washing is not happening, that there's a renewed focus on making sure that whatever claim any organization is making is factual and is a very transparent process. Also, there are now consequences, legal consequences for non-compliance. So it has brought a lot of seriousness into how each organization is looking at ESG and the parameters that are being driven. One of the significant changes that I have seen is just the formulation of a cohesive ESG strategy. Earlier, each different vertical in the organization was doing its own bit. But now, because of the reporting requirements, the whole organization has to get together, figure out what is a ESG strategy that it will follow, and also make sure there is consistency. For a global organization like ours, it's become extremely important for us to make sure that things like how we are defining terms in different jurisdictions are consistent with how they are being defined in India, because we cannot be taking contrary positions. There's also a little bit of thought that is going in terms of the disclosure and the confidentiality provisions. So balancing how we respect confidentiality, for example, in the diversity group data that needs to be disclosed, vis-a-vis what the reporting requirements are. There's also a significant shift in the board involvement. So many of the listed entities now have ESG committees, or at least, any existing committee, which is also very seriously evaluating what the board involvement is, because it's a compliance requirement now. So there are, of course, a lot of consequences that impact the board of directors as well. And generally, a more cohesive strategy is being driven to ensure that the targets that are being set are realistic and sustainable, and also in alignment with the broad vision of the organization, across the globe. So those are some of the changes that I have seen over the last 2-3 years since we've had the SEBI reporting requirements kick in.
Yes. Thank you so much. I think I really liked what you said about the rethinking aspect. So the BRSR has definitely made us rethink a lot of things that we have been doing. And maybe with BRSR, it has been labeled in different categories. So it's a lot of, and also cohesively, we have to come together. So ESG is definitely can't operate in silos. Each function has to come together, for sustainability strategy to actually be driven in an organization. Each function has to come together, and it's a very cross-functional way of working to drive ESG. So thank you, for laying down the, how we have come so far and how companies have upgraded themselves to file BRSR. Because I remember the first year when companies had to file BRSR, it was just it was a humongous task. And ESG is also very highly data driven. So to collate that much of data was a challenging task. But I think we have upgraded ourselves, the listed companies, to be able to file BRSR. Thank you so much. And taking on from this, what Sanjeev has said about BRSR, my next question will be to Mr. Rajiv. I want to ask you that how are companies actually managing the transition from complying with BRSR to BRSR core, which has been recently introduced by SEBI? What are the challenges which companies are facing in ensuring its compliance? Over to you.
Yeah, so thank you, Vidhi, and thanks, Lawwiser, for bringing me or making me part of this very relevant topic. First of all, a disclaimer, the views which I'm expressing is my personal views in my personal capacity or professional capacity. These are not necessarily views of my organization. Coming to, BSR and BSR core and how the transition is happening, I will just like carry on from where Sanjeet kind of laid down the background of the whole ESG piece. If you actually look at the whole intent, behind this BRSR is, basically, I would like to say is that companies today are not being rated or assessed basis only financial numbers. So earlier, it was mostly driven by the what is the top line, what is the bottom line, what is the P ratio, what is the debt equity ratio, what is the profitability. I think considering the way where we are today, and in terms of climate change, I think this is very relevant for all organizations. What actually we are going to leave for the next generation. I think keeping that in mind, SEBI, although it is a capital market regulator, but they want businesses to be more responsible. And now even businesses have also realized, and we kind of echo the saying that green is profitable. It can be profitable because, and I will say how. Coming to BRSR core, basically what it expects, although I'm not an ESG expert, in the sense I'm not an environment expert, I am more of a lawyer. I think the expectation is to report on certain key performance indicators. So while you say, okay, I have good environment practices, now how those environment practices are getting reported, there is a specific reporting, whether it is greenhouse emission footprint, what are the emissions which you are doing, in whether it is CO2 or SO2 or nitrogen oxide, or any gas which is getting emitted in your process, how what is the actual emission, and how you are kind of taking steps to ensure those emissions are getting reduced or getting addressed. So similarly, if you move on, there is a reporting in terms of water, that what are the sources from which you are taking water, whether your what is the total water consumption, whether you have a effluent treatment plant, whether it is a zero discharge plant. And if because today you can't expect to discharge your sewage or water generated during process to any stream, you are necessarily expected to be a zero discharge. When we say zero discharge, basically the entire water has to be recycled and used in the process, because water is a very scarce commodity today. In fact, a company may land up in a situation where if the nearby villagers are not getting water, the authorities may have to come and stop your plant, because so water has to be completely recycled. You can't just discharge, because this goes and affects your groundwater. It can affect, and in the process you're using the water, and the solid waste which is getting extracted from used oil, or it can be any, depending upon the nature of industry. For an automobile company, it can be a sludge coming out from the paint shop. So all those heavy metals are getting extracted from the water, and they are, depending upon, again, in the nature of industry, like in my previous organization in Vedanta, I was working in a copper smelter where we even had a secured landfill. So all the heavy metals or any solid waste which is getting generated used to go into the SLF, and the water was completely recycled. It was a zero discharge plant. Similarly, moving on, you have to report on energy footprint. So what is your energy consumption? What are the energy and intensity? What is your source of energy, whether it is thermal or you are moving into RE. For example, in my current organization, we are looking at RE 100. So basically, we are also moving to trucks which move on electric. So the movement which happened from the mines to carry the mineral, that is already we have started using electric vehicle, just to give an example. Then it also expects companies to report on, you have to embrace basically circular economy. That means, and I think Mr. Mathur is going to touch upon, and EPR is one of the component, of to achieve circular economy, where basically whatever waste you are generating, you are supposed to dispose that waste, including hazardous waste, in a responsible manner, and maybe a lot of value could be extracted from in a circular economy, where something which is a waste for me can be a useful material for some other industry, so that the impact on water and in the air and the soil is minimal. That's the whole objective. So the companies have to specifically report what kind of waste they are generating, how the waste is getting addressed. Moving on, I think it also covers in terms of well-being of your employees, to safety measures, to health measures. How many employees you have, how many employees are permanent, how many are on contractual, how many, what is your gender diversity. So I think when companies have to report on all these numbers, when you actually, it's like when you sit and start writing the exam, then for writing the exam, this is the syllabus. If this is the syllabus and you have to write the answers, you have to prepare well. So I think it's a process. I think ESG, I don't exactly remember all it when it all really started in a serious way, but let's take last 1 decade, and especially last 4 5 years, has brought it into the boardroom and into the management, where companies are forced to have a holistic approach. So I think gender diversity, even in manufacturing, is being thought of, where even women folks can be employed in plants, in remote areas, and even in night shift. So there's a big change. So I think this is very welcome change, because gender diversity, I feel, is very, very important. And then basically it also talks about inclusive development, where how many procurement you are doing directly from the MSMEs or small producers, what is the job creation which you are doing. So it actually, what kind of customers and suppliers you have, how their grievances are getting addressed, what is the number of days in which you pay their bills, accounts payable. Although there is now a specific reporting which is required to be done for MSMEs, initiated by the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. But even here, under the BRSR core, you have to report on these numbers. And then I think the list is pretty long, but considering the time constraint, I think uh, in terms of challenges, yes, it is quite challenging, because I think uh, in the real sense, when you sit across to do, sustainability, there is always a little bit of conflict of interest. But as I told, like, I will give you one example which I kind of wanted to give as a case study, especially in the cement sector, not speaking specifically for cement. For example, there is a solid waste which is generated from thermal power plants, which is called fly ash. Now, it's a very fine powder, which if left in the open, will actually pollute the air. There is a MOF guideline that 100% fly ash has to be disposed of by the power plants. But how do they dispose? So cement companies, after BIS amended the standards, today 35% of entire cement production consumes 35% fly ash. So because it has certain quality in terms of giving strength, and binding properties are there. So a solid waste generated from a thermal power plant is successfully being used in a cement manufacturing company.
Right.
Similarly, I think the municipal waste, especially the segregated plastics, that is being transported to cement plants, and it is being fired in the kiln, and we are using it as a fuel instead of coal. So on one hand, we are able to address, in terms of addressing the the plastic, which is take years to degenerate. It becomes part of the product. So it's a very sustainable way of disposing plastic waste, and at the same time, and helping companies meet their EPR guidelines. And it is also profitable for the cement company, because I am able to substitute coal, so generating less of CO. I would say, less of coal as a fuel. So I'm mining or using less coal and using solid waste to kind of meet my energy consumption.
Hmm.
And when I am producing a blended cement by using fly ash, I'm actually mining lesser limestone, because we call it as a clinker factor. So when you mine limestone,
Right.
you get a intermediate product called clinker, and
Hmm.
clinker is the base material for making cement. So I am elongating the mine life, using less minerals, less mining, and meeting sustainability. I think I will
Right.
stop here, and then we can further elaborate.
I know you have very nicely touched upon all 9 KPIs of BRSR core. And with focus on, of course, gender diversity. Yes, so it's like DNI is something that we now get to hear more, and we get to see companies focusing on it more. And like you mentioned about the focus on MSMEs and accounts payable, and the job creation in rural, semi-urban, urban
Absolutely.
cities. That's really something which BRSR code has very well captured. And
Vidhi, if I can just add, like, for example,
yes,
if we take the S part, now,
right.
all corporates are under obligation, if they are profitable, to spend 2% on CSR. Apart
Hmm.
from that, when you go and take an environment clearance, they additionally impose, to spend
A
on
plantation or some, yes.
no, on basically on the communities, and there is a
Right.
certain percentage of the of the project cost which you have to spend. So what my company and many such manufacturing company are doing is that they are running Disha centers. We call it Disha, somebody calls some other name, where we are training rural folks, who are not maybe 12, they have completed 10th or 12th, they can't, nor they are so intelligent to pursue IIT Delhi, get into IITs or IIMs. So, or, any other qualified job. So they are being trained in, say, electrician job, AC job, and many such trades. And I was surprised when I visited one of the plants that they are getting placed in companies like, Havels, and, all big electrical companies, because they also need talent. And here they are given basic training on say ACE job, and then they are getting employed. So I think we are also creating,
That's really good to know.
employment.
Yes.
So that's
Yes.
very nice. That was very, very, encouraging to see that. And this is all happening in rural India where maybe
Absolutely.
many people don't even reach out.
Yes. Oh, thank you so much for enlightening us with this.
Yeah.
The next question is for Amit. Amit, we would like you to, share your insights on, what strategies can companies employ to manage the value chain disclosure requirements for BRSR reporting?
Thanks a lot, Vidhi, and thank you, Loviser. So, when we look at the requirements which are there in the BRSR, primarily from the value chain reporting. So, first of all, if you look at the overall value chain or primarily the supply chain, majority of the ESG risks for companies, a typical manufacturing company, would come from supply chain. Some of the reports indicate it's close to 70% of the link which risk which comes into. So when we look at this kind of risk, and when we say that ESG majority of it comprises only of the company's information, then we are leaving out that risk, and we are not able to probably capture that risk properly. So this value chain reporting, etc., helps you to identify those risks. So in while BRSR has been made mandatory recently, there have been some frameworks. For example, GRI standards was there, ISSB is there, and other frameworks which already had some information which was required primarily from the supply chain perspective. So now BRSR has the value chain disclosures wherein the 9 BRSR core attributes are to be reported for the value chain, which comprises of 75% of the upstream and downstream value chain. So when companies are trying to comply with it, there are two or three segmentations we can say. So the ones the companies have been historically working on improving the sustainability across their supply chain. These are probably, roughly around less than 10% of the total population of companies in India. If we take top 1,000 listed companies, would be less than 10%. So, however, these companies also have been focusing on improvising their ESG performance across different ratings like S&P Global, CDP, MSCI. All of them have the supply chain sustainability criteria defined. So these are the companies who have been working on their supply chains for many years. So for them, those connects are built in. The trust of suppliers is built in. Their capabilities have been developed. So for them, it is more of getting some additional data inputs and probably putting them together as part of their BRSR reports. Now there comes the second category of companies who primarily have been doing something, but we're not very closely engaged with suppliers. So these companies right now, this is the majority share of the companies who are reporting on BRSR. Close to 60 to 70% of the companies would be in this range who are required to report on the BRSR disclosures. So these companies have started working on their supply chain, and many of these companies are already part of some other company's supply chain as well. So the whole ecosystem, there is some sort of exposure which is there. So they have at least a framework in place. So when we talk of framework, sustainable procurement policy or a supplier code of conduct, which highlights, what the suppliers are supposed to provide the company on a regular basis. So they are just starting off it. Now they're trying to engage with their suppliers, build their capabilities, and start getting the information which needs to be reported upon. Then there is third category, which is again, last around 10 to 15% of the companies who are just starting or just thinking about, how to get started because they face challenges in terms of, who exactly our suppliers are. Typically, defining suppliers for some of the industries is a slightly difficult question. So, for example, the financial sector or service sector, it's slightly difficult because the operations are different. The footprints also come from different places. So that is where trying to answer those questions, put systems into place, and probably will comply. So one of the important things in the whole compliance requirement for the value chain is that it's comply or explain principle at the moment. So it's always advisable that companies do comply with it. However, for some of the indicators, if the companies are not able to get the information from their suppliers, they can provide an explanation on, what were the challenges and by when they will be able to do so. So that is one aspect. The other aspect, which probably, a lot of companies will get hit by this challenge in the month of April and early May, is there is differentiation in the timelines of reporting. Okay, for example, these listed companies have a defined calendar according to which they follow when to publish the annual report, when to publish the BRSR, then there will be AGM, etc. Their suppliers may or may not be listed, who may follow a different calendar than them. For example, if there is company A who is planning to close their books by end of May and publish their annual report, and there is company B who probably takes time in reconciliation of data information and they're ready with their accounts in the month of June. So they may not be able to provide information to company A, who is their customer, and to be reported. So in those cases, probably some approaches like having partial data and extrapolation to a certain extent may help. But all of those things have to be explained very transparently into the BRSR. So this is what currently the situation now is. I'll just take a few seconds to explain probably how things will move forward. So, for example, all of this data eventually, when majority of these companies will comply with, and they will have a good, robust data sets with them of all of their suppliers. So, what do we do with it? Is something very critical because right now the companies are thinking more from the perspective of only compliance. So it's going to be a burden. But if you start thinking of it from a different lens, that you have such a huge amount of data which is coming from all of your suppliers. What do we do with it? Can we integrate it into some sort of decision making, probably the procurement decision making? So instead of evaluating suppliers on their performance and cost, can we also evaluate them on their ESG performance? Some sort of composite metrics so that, the procurement decisions are made more smart and more sustainable. The second aspect could be how do we identify the risks across supply chain? So if the company start thinking around these lines, so this exercise is going to be slightly more helpful as well as beneficial for the overall shareholders in the long run.
Right. I think we've very well covered. It's a very tricky situation for companies to actually handle when it comes to supply chain. What you mentioned about the 75% value chain, it's, upstream, downstream, how many of your vendors are part of it, and most importantly, who actually are suppliers, what is the definition, especially, for the non-manufacturing sector, it's not easy to define. And that is what the challenge is with, with the supply chain management. But what you've really put the focus on is that ecosystem is now being laid out to have that procurement policy in place, the supplier code of conduct, so if, so we of course ask, we share a BRSR code with other companies who are part of our vendors, and we are also asked questions by other companies. So that exchange of, information on what's happening in your organization. Do you have an ESG policy or do you have a supplier code of conduct? I think that interaction between or amongst the companies have really started to build up. So that's a very positive upgradation, I would say, for all of us in that sense, for all the listed companies, where the value chain ecosystem is building up. In these policies, some of the supplier code of conduct was not even existing earlier, right? Now they are. And so thank you so much. And we'll come again to you, Amit. I will now move to Zamir for our next question. Our next question is on stakeholder engagement. So, Zamir, my question to you would be, what role does stakeholder engagement play in ESG? And what strategies can companies employ to foster meaningful stakeholder engagement on ESG issues?
Super, excellent. So, at the forefront of ESG, your stakeholders have only become powerful, right? So when you have your stakeholders, like your shareholders, your investors, they've become more powerful now. And of course, in my next question, I'm also going to show you how governance and environment issues have caused millions of dollars of fines to everyone. But I'll divide my reply into three parts. Number one, what's the amount of investment which is happening in ESG? Number two, certain examples which are there in our mind, and what are the stakeholder strategies which are now applied, and you see the real examples of it getting implemented. I'll talk on the international level also, so that we have a touch point on what is happening on the best practice sides. For example, what has Walmart done in that context, right? The first thing is that there was a news in 2019 saying that ESG funds available to US investors is now 20.6 billion in 2019, which is nearly 4 times the annual record of 2018. This was a news of 2019. The news also said that there are ESG funds which are available in Europe, and they are attracting about 132 billion. This was in 2019. Cut to, we are now moving to about 2022. The amount was 30 trillion. So 20 billion turning into 30 trillion. And 2030, the target is about 40 trillion assets will be under ESG, right? So whatever investments are happening by the investors or the stakeholders or shareholders in the company, they are all companies which are governed under the ESG norm, and the asset under ESG will be about 40 trillion till 2030. That's the change in numbers, right? Now, certain ESG examples which were very prominently known to us earlier in the stage was about Petrobras, Enron, Toshiba, etc., which had some governance issues which came up, and they had a costly affair with the investors in that. There were certain Gulf of Mexico oil spill case where the shares of the company also went for a toss. All right. Now, how do you get into that engagement of stakeholders? There are certain roles which are played by the investors, board, stakeholders to influence ESG compliance in the company, right? Now, there was one study which was done in California Public Employment Retirement System, where there were 188 companies which were compared to their peers for about 14 years. And they turned out that even if you keep peers to peers and those companies which are ESG compliant, the minimum amount of growth which was better than the peers was about 15.27%, right? Now, what is making all this difference is the stakeholder engagement. One of the examples, best example of stakeholder engagement is that the stakeholders of Walmart said that there is a lot of waste management, recycling, which is happening. Let's come out with a Walmart Sustainability Expo. So the first expo was started in 2014. Walmart saved about $231 million by just creating an efficient waste management and recycling system. All right. There was an estimate of about $150 million which was saved through renewable energy projects and zero waste management program. So that's the initiative which the stakeholder now has taken up as a strategy to implement ESG, as well as it benefits the environment, but also benefits the organization in a way. All right. What is the second driver of the strategy which is applied by the stakeholders? The stakeholders are now insisting on a direct dialogue, shareholder proposals, proxy voting, public policy engagement, divestment, etc. All right. One of the examples which we can give is about Facebook. All right. So what Mark Zuckerberg had done is that he reclassified the shareholders, saying that there are certain shareholders which are to be reclassified, certain shareholders, officers, and directors of Facebook, whereby Mark Zuckerberg was giving up 65% of the stake in the company, but still remaining a major voting holder, right? Now, what the shareholders did is that they file a class action suit against the company and the founder. Just before the days the trial could start, there was a settlement and the reclassification of the shareholders were dropped. All right. So that's the kind of strategy which the stakeholders are now doing it. One of the best examples we remain is the British Petroleum Deepwater Horizon 2010 case, where there was an oil spill which had happened in Gulf of Mexico. British Petroleum lost about 50% of their market share, of their share price in the market. Because of this disaster, the share price not only underperformed, but even their investors came forward and said that we want to now have a discussion on your environment pollution, occupational health and safety issues, negative impact which it is having to the local communities. So that's the strategy which has been used. The third is the shareholders proposal which keep coming to you. All right. So one of the best examples is that uh, this is of a US example where New York City Comptroller had asked the companies to make the right of investors to nominate directors on the company ballot, proxy ballot. All right. So even the proxy holders were given that particular charge. Now, what had happened is that these companies had larger shareholders. The shareholders were big companies which were holding the pen on their hand. But what happened because of this initiative? All the large shareholders like JP Morgan, etc. So 60% of the large shareholders, they agreed to that. And this became enforceable on a company known as ExxonMobil, which is one of the biggest oil companies, right? The fourth strategy is applied absolutely on the proxy voting. Now, in a proxy voting, what happens is that there are certain companies where you'll find all these big shareholders, right? When I spoke about Fidelity, Vanguard, BlackRock, these are all large shareholders. They are not amenable to any of these things, and they dominate the positions on the voting. But if you see, if the proxy voting is given such right, then 62% of the shareholders voting in support of the proposal of ExxonMobil, which also included their larger shareholders like Fidelity, Vanguard, and BlackRock, created one of the histories, right? Because they implemented that shareholder voting program. The last one is a public policy engagement. Now, in public policy engagement, what happens is that there are certain sets of investors who are basically having the voting right, but then general issues come up like Paris Climate Agreement and all that. In 2017, there was a drive which was taken place internationally where 390 investors representing about $22 trillion in asset wrote a letter to G20 saying that we support Paris climate change, and wherever we have invested, we are going to vote in favor of the Paris climate change. So that's the public policy engagement which is happening, right?
Right.
I think these are 5 strategies which are being applied by the stakeholders together with the examples like Walmart, etc., which I gave, which is really not only benefiting on the ESG side of it, but also getting on the organization side of it on how they should behave in future from the perspective of ESG. That's about the strategies for stakeholder from my side. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Sameer. Actually, through all these examples, you have highlighted how companies are in their unique ways responding to, the queries and the complexity of situations to cater to such stakeholder engagement, which is a very, very, I would say, the foundation part of ESG. That's where it starts. So, and in stakeholder engagement, it's both, the internal stakeholder management, the external stakeholder management. So even within the organization, how the stakeholder can be managed by formulating, say, an ESG policy. Have we considered, the relevant functional heads and the functions responsible to drive ESG? So thank you, Sameer. And I will, since you have laid down this, broad statistics and numbers and data, my question from here would be to Amit. Amit, I would really like you to talk to us about that, how, companies are how do they actually collect and report ESG data? What challenges do they face in terms of also at the same time maintaining the accuracy and reliability? Because BRSR is very humongous in terms of data collation and to synthesize the data, and then to also like make use of that data to improvise in the company itself. So your insights on this, please.
Yeah, thanks, Vivi, for this question. So this is one of the very critical exercises that companies have to carry out on an annual basis. So one is that, if you look at the complete format that BRSR has, so this will cover almost, or this will probably touch upon almost every function within any organization. So it's not only, say, a job of one department, which is sustainability department, to give all the data. It's like everybody across the company has to provide their input so that your BRSR becomes complete. And that is true for almost every other reporting framework, including GRI standards, ISSB, and even the ratings which the companies submit their responses on. So, having said this, now there are challenges again at different levels. So, if we look at the companies who are fairly advanced in this journey, they have overcome these challenges to a great extent. However, the companies who are beginning this journey, it takes a lot of time for them to kind of, put things in place and, focus on it. So, one of the core of these challenges is understanding what is required, because almost all of the data points within BRSR are very specific, very clear in terms of what information is required. However, the definitions of individual terms are not clearly defined in the BRSR disclosures. So the companies have to take help of probably GRI standards or other frameworks to decipher what does it mean. So clearly defining what is required and what needs to be provided in an organization's context is one of the core things, or the one of the major challenges. The next thing is almost like, as part of every organization, there are people who uh, change roles, who resign from particular role, and so on and so forth. So that turnaround happens every year. So the change management in terms of whosoever the new person comes in should also have the clear understanding of what ESG requirements were. Because the core function and the core job, there are documented SOPs, documented procedures. However, majority of the organizations have not documented the processes and procedures around ESG. So that is one very critical challenge. Then coming down to the fact that, do we have any controls in place to ensure that data which goes out as part of BRSR is accurate and is complete. So that is where the major challenge comes into when the reports are about to be published. So majority of the companies look at this as a once in a year exercise. So they will start capturing the information during first or second week of April, and then try to, look into whether information is correct or not. However, the lack of internal control that, can we do it on a quarterly basis? Can there be a mechanism that this information is reviewed on a quarterly basis, like how all other financials are reviewed, so that by end of the year, the information is complete and is provided in an accurate manner. So that is one level of challenge which companies are facing. And nowadays, there are solutions as well. Like, for example, technology is becoming one of the very important tools for companies to address the challenges, because there are organizations which have a limited footprint, for example, few plants, few offices, etc. So for them, it's easy to collate all of that information, combine together, and put forward in an integrated manner. However, for the organizations who have a very sporadic footprint, for example, say banks who have, say, thousands of branches all across India, how do you collate information from all of these branches, and how do you put it out in an accurate manner? So that still is a challenge, and probably technology can play an important role here. However, the completeness of the information and the accuracy of information still remains a challenge unless and until companies have a detailed internal control mechanism in place. So that is overall on what issues these data faces. Now coming down to another challenge, which generally comes once the reports, etc., are published. So there are comparatives in almost every reporting format. For example, BRSR provides comparatives for 2 years. And there are some situations where uh, because of human error or because of some challenges, companies have not taken into consideration certain footprint. Say, for example, one small plant operating somewhere, or one small source of fuel. So sometimes what happens is these changes or these challenges are difficult to remediate for a report which has been published. So, and like how in case of GRI standards, the BRSR does not clearly provide any mechanism for restatement of information in the previous financial reports. So that is where we have to take help of, different standard and interlinkages, how the whole ecosystem of the standard making is structured. All of these things play a very important role here. And the tools which are available to address such situations have to be tailored to every industry. So there are a lot of, in my personal experience of last, 14, 15 years working in this field, I've seen that many of the technology implementations across ESG have failed. And the only reason for it is we try to plug and play a solution which is already available for another industry as it is into a different set of industries. So ESG is such a topic which is very much industry specific, very much context specific and organization specific. So whatever tools the companies try to impart or deploy should have ability to align to its own nuances, align to see how the information has to be collated and how the information has to come out with the approach for traceability of the information from where it actually comes in. So these are some of the things. And as we move forward and as we, look probably say 5 years down the line, um, probably a situation where IoT-based devices or existing systems which are capturing the information in the first place are directly connected to some sort of system wherein you can see the data live could resolve a lot of these challenges. But those systems are going to be intensive. They will require a lot of efforts and investment by the companies. But that is what it's going to take. Yeah.
Thanks, Amit. Absolutely agree. Data collation, I think technology is really, really important to kind of add up to the accuracy and reliability. We are also, we have kind of nearing the final lap of our webinar. So we will, I will request all the panelists to, be mindful of the time. My next question on this would be to now Zamir, where I would request you to share some well-known cases that have impacted organization towards reflection on how critical ESG is for companies. So maybe briefly, if you can just throw some light on it, Zamir, please.
Right. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I'll just name those cases, some 5, 6, 7 cases where this was much in the limelight on the lines of ESG. One of the cases I spoke about is Facebook, of course, where the founder Mark Zuckerberg and other officers and directors they were sued for breach of fiduciary duties because they were trying to reclassify themselves as another set of shareholders, and then the other shareholders were followed, which means that they were going to sell out the stake in the company by over 65%, but still maintained about majority voting control. Which days before the class action suit began, the board abandoned the reclassification part of it, taking up the fiduciary duty for that particular purpose. Another one is the DuPont case. DuPont was in the news because of the disposal of the toxic. $75 million were part of the settlement. Then there is one case of 21st Century Fox, which was a sexual harassment case, and where the fiduciary duty was also breached by the officers and the board, resulted in a 90+ million settlement plus corporate reforms. News Corp was in the news for a settlement of about $139 million with significant reforms. There was a suit which was filed saying that there's a lack of governance because News Corp being owned by Rupert Murdoch, it's only focused on the agenda and the political affiliation of that organization, and that it's not focused on the fiduciary part of it. Again, it resulted in a settlement. There is CBS Corporation on social and governance. They had a settlement of about $167 million. Then there was Teva. Teva is a pharmaceutical company where there was an allegation of that there was a generic drug pricing fixing controversy, which was a governance issue and resulted into a $420 million settlement. Another was about a Royal Dutch Shell company, which was about $450 million settlement. Monsanto was on the news because carcinogen is a very toxic chemical, and there was a suit filed on the contamination. It resulted on environmental impact and a settlement of about $550 million. A very well-known case, the last case was about Volkswagen, which was an issue that they had developed a defeat device where the diesel in vehicles, in order to cheat on its emission test. This resulted in a 14.7 billion settlement. So I think these are cases which are landmark cases in ESG. That's where the directionally we are going on environment, social, and governance. That's the examples from my side. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I thought the Fox one being also covered in our Netflix documentary. So thank you so much.
All cases are cases outside India.
Yes. Yes. So yeah, I think that's I think the global aspect of ESG. I will actually now move on to our next speaker, Dr. Abhinav Mathur. He's the advisor to the board at Atero, a recycling company, and he's also the founder of Million Sparks Foundation, a non-for-profit which is focused on education initiatives. He has more than 3 decades of experience in global leadership roles and has consistent.
We can skip that, maybe,
Yes. So yes, I mean, of course, you will, be talking about this, but, you have a impressive, work profile, which I wanted the audience to know about. But the question to you would be, focusing specifically on EPR. One of the agenda for today's webinar is circular economy. And my question to you would be, how effective is extended producer responsibility in reducing e-waste? And what do you think are the challenges in implementing such policies?
Sure. So first of all, thank you so much for the opportunity. And sorry for cutting you off. I think the time was too less.
Yes.
And my profile, I believe my team would have sent would be a little longer than would be required. So very quickly, I think some of our audience might not even know what EPR is, but EPR is basically extended producer responsibility. The basic principle being that if there is a corporate which is making profit from delivering certain products or services out to consumers or to customers of their own, they should be responsible for removing any waste which is getting generated from that activity. So the simplest example, if you're Bisleri, if you're Pepsi, you're selling a bottle which has your product, you make money from it. The waste which is getting generated, which is the empty plastic bottle, just gets thrown into dustbins or onto the roadside, etc. It should be your responsible, and therefore somewhere you have to own up and ensure that that gets recycled. Similarly, in the electronic waste industry, so if you're making a refrigerator, if you're making a air conditioner, which has a life of 10 years, 10 years from the time that you have sold it to the customer, therefore, logically, this would already have been obsoleted or turned into waste. At that time, the company which sold that particular product 10 years ago should be responsible for taking that and ensuring that it is recycled, and whatever sort of harmful materials are there, they do not get to impact the environment. So that's the policy which came into place in 2016 onwards. It was getting formulated, and it is now getting implemented in its spirit in the year of 2018-19. That's what has happened. Atero has been in business in 2008, so we have seen the operations when there was no EPR policy, and now we are obviously benefiting a little from that. What you need to understand, in India, this year close to 3 million tons of electronic waste is getting produced. And today, India's capacity to actually recycle that in a formal manner is less than 20%. Right? Now, without EPR, all of the electronic waste was getting recycled in the informal sector, and which is harmful, right? So most of the time, what happens that the informal sector does, it basically takes whatever products that you have given to it in form of waste. They will go and try to extract whatever materials are there inside of it with whatever sort of technologies they are aware of, right, or they know of, and these are mostly very rudimentary, extremely polluting. So for example, a copper wire has a lot of copper inside that. It's basically covered by a plastic sheath. They will basically burn it in the open, and that will cause a lot of harmful gases getting emitted in the environment. So from an environment standpoint, it is extremely bad whatever practices are done. So to extract gold, they will put a chipset or a motherboard into very, very strong acids, able to extract only 4 things from it, not all the elements which are there inside it. And whatever remains inside of that, sort of acid bath, along with whatever harmful components are there, are thrown back into the landfill, etc. So from an environmental standpoint, of course, it is extremely important that EPR kind of services are sort of implemented. The other thing it actually allows is also it basically gives certain, sort of, I would say, profit margins for the formal recyclers to work. So think of an informal sector worker, right? He basically collects the electronic waste from you, recycles it at the back in his backyard, right? Whereas you have to have all these formal practices, you have to pay GST and all those things, right? So it doesn't, so the business itself does not allow viability if there is no extra fees. By introduction of EPR, what the government has done is it has given birth to the formal recycling industry in true terms, which now has the leeway to be able to invest in R&D to ensure that less harmful technologies are getting developed. There is no external emissions which are happening. There is no water which is getting put back into the rivers and stuff like that. So the capability to invest more and more into ensuring that better technologies are existing, more recovery is happening, is coming in because of the EPR getting implemented. Now to the challenges. So there are several challenges even today. So if you look at it, India, when the CPCB came up with this particular policy in India, close to 500 odd recyclers have been given birth, right? There is a very clear written down policy with regards to how these recyclers have to be approved and given the permission to operate. But obviously, there are some mechanisms by which these guys go to a CPCB and are able to fake documents, are able to fake their capacities, technologies, etc. And so, therefore, in the ecosystem, less than 10% of these 500 odd recyclers have the right technologies. But there are certain recyclers, or rather at least registered recyclers, that basically operate a little fraudulently, where they do not do any recycling as such. They continue to pass on whatever electronic waste is back to the informal sector. But on the paper, they provide these permits and certificates to the large corporates so that they can claim that they have done recycling. So that's one. The second challenge, I believe, is that the bigger corporates, even they don't know and they have the wherewithal to be able to audit and figure out whether the recyclers are genuine recyclers and they can do the right, correct processes in recycling, they still give it to the lower guys because they are asking them for less money to do these EPR credits, right? So that's unfortunate. Although they say that we have given it to only those people who have been a registered recycler, but that is something, they stand behind the regulation, they stand behind the CPCB. Look, you have approved these recyclers, we are giving it to only approved recyclers. So that's another challenge. The third, of course, is now there is no clear audit mechanisms which have been put in place by CPCB. And I think while there are theoretically those audit mechanisms, but I think they have to be implemented a little better. There has to be a capacity building of the CPCB and the SPCB officials themselves, so that they can basically distinguish between the right recyclers and the wrong recyclers. And there should be a responsibility at the end of the corporate itself. I think I'll conclude by that. Of course, there is a longer answer to this, but given the paucity of time, I'll just stop here, and maybe
Yes,
if there
no,
are any questions around this, I can answer them.
yes. I mean, building upon this, I will just probably ask you something that, how do you think that an effective EPR implementation can actually help with circularity and helping the nation also build the recycling ecosystem? And why do you think it's important? If you can briefly enlighten us with your thoughts on this.
Sure. So, from a circularity standpoint, let's understand, why and what is recycling contributing. So if you look at the laptops or the phones that you are right now using to have this call, there are close to 60 elements from the periodic table. And sorry for the chemistry lesson, but there are close to 60 elements of the periodic table which are present in these devices. So there is gold, there is silver, there is platinum, there is neodymium, there is duodenum, there is lithium, cobalt, nickel, manganese, graphite. I could go on. It's a list of 60 elements which are there. Now, when it is going to the informal sector, now they have limited technology, right? Now, this limited technology allows them to only extract maybe a few of these metals, gold, silver, copper, copper is where they typically stop, maybe a little bit of iron as well. And this is where they typically stop. Now, if we continue to use informal sector practices, what will happen is that while these gold, etc., is getting extracted, the rest is getting lost forever into rivers, into landfills, etc. And these are extremely valuable resources for us. And let me explain to you what do you mean by that. Now, if you look at any technology, whether it is space tech, we already talked about semiconductors, we already talked about laptops and smartphones, etc., which are becoming very critical. But if you look at space tech, if you look at renewable energy, so we are talking about solar panels, we are talking about lithium-ion batteries, we are talking about EVs. So take any technology which you can think of in the future, even simple things like paints. Paints requires cobalt. Mental health, medicines require lithium inside of that. The same things, lithium and cobalt, go into making a battery. Now, these are very, very critical for the future in every which way. Defense technologies, right? So all of them require these critical metals. Now, if they get lost again and again in the waste stream, or even remain captured or remain in that waste stream and nobody's really extracting them, India at this point in time is totally dependent upon imports. And not only imports, but imports largely from China, which is not really a friendly country right now, right? So if we remain dependent on these, then we are done forever. And at least 20 to 30% of the sort of requirements of the country itself can come from this waste stream itself. So I'm a part of a group in NITI Aayog which is looking at how much material do you require in 2070 for India to be on a path of growth, 2047 and 2070, right? Now, what we figured out, I'm so sorry.
The Viksit Bharat 2047.
Yeah, Viksit Bharat, right? So the amount of material which is required is going to be humongous, and which will be a huge problem on the import bill. And the whole world is competing for these critical materials. The Ministry of Finance has come out with a list of 30 critical materials, and they're trying to figure out how do we ensure a resilient supply chain for us. So the circularity, if we are enabling that circularity and ensuring this recycling ecosystem gets developed, we will be less, at least much less dependent than otherwise. And the recycling ecosystem requires some profit. So we also figured out that if we were to build the recycling ecosystem to the one which could actually ensure that the waste stream is completely recycled, the amount of money which is required is huge. The government does not have the money, the current private sector does not have the money, and we can't attract that much capital into the system. The EPR ensures that there is some amount of profitability which remains with these recycling companies so that they can continue to invest and grow to the scale that India requires. And today it is 3 million tons. The next 2 years it will be 4 million tons, and probably by 2030 this will turn to close to around 7 to 8 million tons getting accumulated every year. If we don't invest into this, we are going to be sitting on a huge pile of electronic waste, which is extremely bad for the health.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think yes, so EPR is definitely building up really well. And I will actually now, with the paucity of time, I will go to Sanjeet now. Sanjeet, like in this webinar, most of our panelists are the general counsels. And I would like you to share your views on what do you think what is the relationship of general counsel, in terms of, the equation that they share with the senior management, the board, and the external stakeholders, and also the internal stakeholders. How does that help in facilitating ESG integration in a company?
Vidhi, the question itself has a answer in terms of the use of the word integration, because with ESG, as we have heard, throughout the discussion, it is not one function or one business which is going to be driving the ESG in any organization. It's it's everyone across the organization who have their own impact and their own scope. What helps, for a GC to become an important stakeholder is the fact that, of course, there's a legal risk that is involved. And now with all the reporting requirements coming in, it's also something that falls under the risk and the compliance toolkit of a GC. And taking that a little bit further, we're also now hearing a lot of, jurisprudence coming out that because of, for example, the greenwashing and the social washing issues, the legal risk is also becoming encompassing and involving ethical and reputational risk. So that's just the broad, ambit of what some of the direct involvement of the GC is for the ESG piece. But where they become an integrator and an important stakeholder in the whole process of the ESG integration is GCs often play the role of a convener. We are working with the policymakers, we are working with the investors. Often we are also responsible for the risk in an organization, and of course compliance is anyway a part of it, and just the business strategy, the business operations. So GCs are able to use the insights that they have from these multiple hats that they wear to make sure that the organization and the ESG policy and the strategy is moving in the right direction. Also because GCs are the trusted advisors of the organization, and they're also the guardians. It's a neutral voice which is looking after the stakeholder interest, the ethics piece. So they just become an independent voice to make sure that, one, the policy is right and is compliant, but also that whatever the organization is committing to, they are actually able to deliver on it. So you get insights from the board, and then the GCs also have their external network. And as a part of the senior management, they're able to drive a lot of process integration. Many a times the different verticals or the different businesses in an organization operate in silos, but the legal function generally has oversight across functions and businesses to make sure that there is a cohesiveness that is being driven in the strategy. And at the end of the day, now with all the regulatory framework, it is a reporting requirement. So the buck will stop with the GC in case there are any misrepresentations or non-compliances, etc.
Absolutely. And there was somebody from the audience who's asked this question also, which you've just answered, that, how GCs can drive in responsible ESG strategy, driving the ESG strategy. So thank you, Sanjeev, for, sharing your insights. I will, ask Rajiv to actually share, a lot of questions around this also, like, as, what will be India's ESG regulatory landscape look like in future? How do you think we will respond to the global developments? So what are the future trends according to you in ESG landscape, given the kind of experience that you have had?
Yeah, I think a lot of changes is already happening, and I think the next generation will like to be associated with a corporate, be it in terms of products, services, or even as a potential employer, to be a company which is more responsible, especially in terms of their environment practices, whether it is human rights, whether it is what societal good they do, what is their policy in terms of your governance, your anti-bribery, and in the entire ESG piece. And today, I think even your bankers, when you are typically taking a long-term loan, I never saw this kind of clauses 10 years ago, but today they want you that you are operating the business in compliance with full compliance. And if there is any reporting that some emission has been reported, even right or wrong, if there is a news article, the relationship manager of your lender writes an email. He wants a complete explanation that what has happened. So even today, whether if you see the entire ecosystem in which a corporate operates, I think people are looking at more responsible corporates, and I think that is what is going to drive. And I will not name the organization, but like one of the companies where I was working, and it was a multinational, Indian multinational, and there were few fatalities. And in India, fatalities, I would say 20 years ago was not taken very, I would not taken very seriously, in the sense, yes, yeah, theek hai, we are giving training, but a person has died, what can we do? Today it is very different. If you are operating in 20 location, and God forbid if even 10 people die, and you have to face the shareholders in the company, somebody where 10 people have died for whatever reason, you have to be answerable. So even at the board level, any fatality is taken very seriously, where CEO has to come and explain that we don't want any ton of production at the loss of a life. This was not there 20 years ago, 10 years ago. So I think the perspective has completely changed. And I think when one you do by choice, but sometimes you have to do it because it is also, how people perceive you. Your entire credit rating agency, capability to raise funds. Now there is a reward for higher ESG rating where you can borrow funds at a lower rate. So and that is something which any management would like to opt for. So I think all these changes are very welcome. It's a journey. I think we have started the journey and we are gradually progressing in the right direction.
You're right, actually, so what you actually said in the beginning also, that ESG is not just about the financial, it's all about the non-financial disclosures. And the
Absolutely.
focus from, financial disclosures to non-financial disclosures is what ESG highlights, right? So the sustainability report, the ESG report of a company gives the insight as to what they're doing in terms of, like what give the example of any, debt taking place during the employment. That's now taken very, very seriously. And companies are held accountable if such instances are taking place. So we are for sure that ESG is going to, be a more critical part of making a responsible business in India. So it may have different forms and shapes, but we know that we are heading towards making responsible business strategies.
Yeah. From a regulatory license to operate, you need a social license to operate.
Absolutely. Well said. I will request Lavanya to pitch in because we have a lot of questions coming in from the participants, and a few of them have already been answered while in the course of the webinar. Lavanya, if you can help us with the questions, pouring in now.
Yes, sure. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time. I know we have about 8 minutes, so I'll pick up a couple of questions. Vidhi, you can let me know if you feel this one's been more or less covered. We need to jump to the next one. Let me know.
Sure.
I'm going to start with a question which is actually for Abhinav. So I mean, the attendee is asking, how can the infrastructure be improved? Like, how can infrastructure better support a circular economy?
You're on mute.
Sorry, you're on.
So, infrastructure in the sense, for the circularity to happen, there are two things, of course. One is policy and, of course, infrastructure. So for infrastructure, I personally think that one of the biggest things that has to happen is that velocity of recycling should also increase. And by which I mean that, if you look at the people who are attending this particular conference itself, if you think about your own drawers, I think you'll have a couple of smartphones and a couple of laptops lying in your home, which you have not really given back to recycling, right? So I think, education is a very, very important part. While it's